Welcome to Sew with Monty. Today I want to begin a series of videos about your overlocker serger machine. And I know a lot of you have this machine or a similar one at home that you rarely use, if you've ever used it at all. Some you may even have in the box. So we want to get you familiar with this machine and not feel so intimidated about its use so that you can enjoy all the benefits of using it. I'm using a Brother 1034D. Now this is a very entry-level machine, priced very well, usually anywhere from $200 to $250 is retail for this machine. It's a good, reliable machine. It doesn't have a lot of the amenities and bells and whistles that a more advanced machine might have, but it's a great starter machine. And you may have something similar to this. You might have models that are a little more advanced than this, but overall the information I'm going to give you will feed into whatever machine you have, and we'll go over that as we go through this. So I want to go over some basics with you about the machine. This is a 2-needle 4-thread machine, and when you're purchasing a serger machine, this is the best overall machine to get. It's the right amount because these are the stitches you're going to use most frequently. Getting a 3-thread limits the amount of things you can do. Getting more than this sometimes can be overwhelming. So this is really the most popular and probably the most practical, is a 4-thread machine. 2 needles and 2 carriers here. So basically, let's just go over the anatomy of the machine a little bit so you can get familiar with what your machine is all about. The colorful dials here on the front, now this will vary depending on your machine, but you need to find where they are. These are your tension guides. Now some machines, if they're more advanced, this will be automated and you really won't have the option of figuring your tension out, otherwise the machine will do it for you. But if you have a more basic model, you're probably going to have access to figuring out your own tensions here. In the back, these are your spindles, and this is where you put your thread. Now, let's talk about thread. It is a good idea to invest money in basic colored cone thread. Like I have blacks, white, gray, neutrals like a brown, blue, red, yellows, just your basic colors, because that way you always have them on hand. This machine uses a lot of thread. So using a spool of thread such as this, it doesn't last quite so long because of all the thread you're actually going to use on your serger. It's not impossible to use this on your serger. You can do it. Just be careful when you use a spool of thread that the little nick right here, I don't know if you can see it, but there's a little nick in the edge of your spool. You want to make sure that you keep that downward so that your thread, as it's coming off the spool, doesn't get caught in that nick and mess up your stitching. But it can be used. It's preferred though to use cones if you have it. So let's go over some more parts here. Now this is your tension here, and if you release this plate, and now everybody's is a little different how they operate, you can see the inside workings, and this is the part that usually intimidates people when they're talking about their serger. But you have what's called a lower looper, which is the blue line here. And let me just turn the wheel so you can see it a little better. And I'm going to move in a little bit with my zoom here so you can see it just a little bit carefully. A little bit more. There we go. Now, this bottom looper is this one right here. I don't know if you can see it very well. Let me get my tweezers. I can probably point it out this way. It's the lowest looper with a hole in it that carries thread. It's usually the last one on the spindle here that goes through this tension. And this is color marked. So the blue line, the blue dots, tell me how to thread this lower looper. Now, the nice part about that, the newer machines, you have to thread both ends, but you used to have to physically get back here inside the machine and thread this end, and it was just about impossible. Now they have these clever little dials where you can put the thread in and you close it back up, and we'll go over that when we start threading it. And it makes it so easy to thread this versus trying to get back there and physically thread it with your tweezers and whatever else you've got to thread it with. So this is your lower looper right here. This other one right here is called your upper looper. Those are your two loopers, and the way they engage is what causes that stitch that loops around itself in the back. The inside needle is the stitch that goes right in the middle of your overlock stitch. This one is always in the inside. This one is on the outside, and this one creates the width of the overlock stitch and gives you your seam stitch. In other words, the one that will represent a seam in a garment if you want to use your overlock and nothing else to make seams. So this is your seam needle on the far left. This one's like a safety stitch needle in here, just to hold things in control. Upper looper and lower looper. And that's basically all there is to this machine. And threading it is another thing. We'll go over that in another video. So let's keep going on here. I'm going to turn the machine just a little bit to the left because I want to show you what's going on this side of the machine. Now, everyone will have this. It'll be in different places, but this is your pressure foot lift. So that's your pressure foot lift right there. Now, it'll be in different places. Some of them will be back here. So you need to find this on your machine where this is. Okay. This is the tension. Screwing this up and down causes tension on this presser foot. So let's say you're working on a really lightweight fabric. You may want to increase your tension by going right and then left to loosen. So if it were a lightweight fabric, a little more tension is necessary. A thicker fabric like a flannel or something like that, you might want to loosen the tension a little bit. As you're sewing, you can tell by the way your fabric's behaving under your pressure foot whether this needs to be adjusted. I wouldn't worry about it right at the moment, as you're sewing probably mostly average, medium to lightweight fabrics, and it should be set appropriately. This will be a more advanced issue that we'll deal with a little later in another video. So let me go back over here to the side. We have our pressure foot right here, and this is the wheel. You always want to turn this wheel forward. This is if you have to hand crank your stitch for any reason. See, as I do this and I'm going forward, see the mechanisms are moving. Let me move this out of the way. You want to make sure you always, always, always turn this wheel forward. If you don't, you're going to cause a tangle in your thread. Even more so than on a regular machine. And I'm sure you've been told always turn your wheel forward on that. Well, even more so on this machine because of that very feature. Okay, now I'm going to turn it around to this side because I want you to see what's going on the right side. Now, again, these dials and all this information is on your machine, but it may be in a little bit different place depending on the model. But I want to help kind of guide you through what this is. Now, this first little guide right here is my stitch width. This causes the stitch to become narrow and wide right here. Okay, there's a limit how wide it will get, but these are millimeters, 5, 6, and 7. The 5 is average. So if you're just doing something where you want to cast off the edge and you don't need to have it perform any other duties, then 5 is probably where you need to be. The R stands for rolled hem, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. There's little symbols here that remind you, hey, this is narrow, this is wide. 7 is the largest, and I like to use 7 when I'm actually making a seam. That way I know I'm getting as much fabric on my seam allowance as possible. So I have mine right now set on 7 because that's the last thing I was doing, was making seams on a garment. Now, that's your stitch width. Right here is your stitch length. And this determines how many stitches in an inch or whatever increment it is you're going to get. Again, I've got mine on the very longest, which is 4. 3 is the suggested length right here. See, the little dark marks are 3. This is a little bit smaller too. And then right in this little bar area is R. That again is for the rolled hem. So for the moment, we'll just leave it on 3, which is standard. Now, this little dial here is a very clever little dial. This is called a differential feed. And if you leave it on 1, that's going to just do a regular stitch. If you push it down to 7, and some of you may even have more, 0.7 or less, this is going to cause the fabric to stretch. And this is a really nice technique to use when you are trying to do a lettuce edge or a decorative stitch. It also helps if you're sewing on something that's kind of getting bound or held. You can put it down here and it will loosen the tension on it, or the grip on it, and allow it to be a flatter, easier stitch. So this helps adjust your stitch depending on how your fabric's feeding through your machine. If you go up this way, it will literally gather your fabric. Not heavily gather it like a gathering foot, but it will do a subtle gather on your fabric so that you can actually use it to put a pucker or a gathering in or ease something in when you're trying to sew on something. It also controls if the fabric's getting stretched with your machine. This will hold it in place and not have it stretch out of shape. Always though, unless you're intentionally doing anything different, try to start on your 1-to-1 ratio here, which is just normal. Now your numbers may appear differently. What I suggest is look in your manual and see how they're represented. Mine are represented 2.0 being the tightest gather it will do, and 0.7 being the longest stretch it will do. This is called a differential feed. It feeds your fabric at different quantities in through your pressure foot. So it controls how it's fed through there and keeps it from getting out of shape. This little dial right here is very simple. This lowers my blade. Now when you use this right here, in fact when you use any of these stitches, make sure that your needles are up and out of the machine. Don't do any of this dial changing with your needles down in the machine. You could break a needle or bend a needle. But this will lower my blade, so if I want to sew without the blade on, like maybe I'm sewing on something I'm a little nervous I'm going to cut it, I can use this to get the blade out of the way. And back it is. So this lowers the blade and raises the blade. Again, yours may be inside your machine, but that's a very important stitch as well. Now let's go back to the front. We have, on this particular machine, the option of having a sleeve roll here, so you can put a cuff or pant leg or something here to control this, which I really like because I've used this more than I thought I actually would. Also, your machine usually comes with a spent thread or a little lint carrier, which means, and I have to raise mine up a little bit to get it in there. This way, it just puts all the residue in here, and you can just empty it in the trash instead of ending up with on your fabric or your clothing or in your lap. So this is a really nice thing to have as well. Now, in this little section of this video, I'm going to go over one more tool that you're going to need, actually two. These are tweezers, and these tweezers are bent to help you thread your needles and thread all of your loop carriers down here, all your thread carriers. It's very nice to have because you can get into angles that you couldn't normally get into with the tips of your finger. So make sure you have a set of these with your machine. If you don't, you need to get you a set because they're very integral to using this machine. And the last one is, you want this little brush handy because it's very important while you're sewing. And if you're sewing on a garment, every now and then come in here and just clean out these areas and make sure that you don't have a lot of lint build up in your machine, because this can really make or break your stitching. So you want to keep a little brush handy so that you can keep your machine clean as you're sewing. Another thing you can do is a small vacuum or a little gun of air and just blow it out so that you can keep it nice and clean. So anyway, that's the first part of our video. I just wanted to get you familiar with your machine. I suggest you get your book out and try to find these elements on your machine so that you get familiar where everything is. The next video we're going to do, I'm going to teach you how to thread the machine and adjust your tension.